Welcome to selfdiscoveryradio.com, where the orchard of wisdom is just ready for picking. We celebrate your why, the journey that you've taken that inspires someone else. We support your services, we support your story. Come and be our guest, become a host, be an author with us. Come and see what we've got. Our next show is... Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Eco Solutions. I'm your host, Sara Troy, and my guest today is Tom Harris. We're going to be talking about his international climate science correlation, about climate change. Now, he's not denying that the climate is most certainly changing, but what he is saying is that this is a natural course for the Earth to take. If you look back historically and the changes that the Earth has gone through, it goes through these transitions every 1,000 years, 100 years, I'm not quite sure. We're going to find out from him today. But what we have to look at is, what is our contribution as humanity? Are we escalating this climate change? Are we ready for what's to come? Because most certainly it is going to change, and we're going to have to change along with it. And what can we do about it to slow the process down? Because yes, renewable energy, and yes, less plastic, and yes, to all those things that we can contribute to help things along. But the one thing we can't do is stop the climate from changing, because that's inevitable, isn't it, Tom? Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, the bottom line is that climate changes on any planet with a dynamic atmosphere, and that includes, of course, the Earth. I mean, the Earth's atmosphere is incredibly complex, and that's one of the reasons that we get our weather forecasts wrong so often. You know, trying to get next week's weather is pretty tough. And so the idea that we can forecast climate decades in advance, I mean, that's pretty far-fetched. And so what we say is, okay, we're probably contributing to some climate change. How much it is, we don't know, but we can adapt to climate change, and we can help the poor of the world adapt. And that's the approach we should take. And of course, continue the scientific research so that someday we may actually be able to forecast climate.
Right, or maybe even change it. Who knows,
Yeah,
right? So,
exactly.
because there's a lot of things that can happen there. Now, when you do look historically back, you know, the Sahara Desert used to be, was it a sea or a river?
Yeah.
And we look back, you know, in history to other things that once, you know, was abundant in this is now dry land. And also with the fires that we're having here right now, and the heat waves that are going on that are, you know, blowing everybody's mind, as well as their budget on air conditioning. Are we looking at the climate change as the escalation in heat as a standard, as a norm, do you think?
Well, yeah, since the end of the Little Ice Age, which was a cold period that ended around 1880, we've seen a gradual, steady rise in temperature. And that's a good thing, because back in Charles Dickens's time and previously, it was not particularly nice to live. I mean, I believe it was in around the middle of the 1700s, they would have frost fairs on the Thames River in London, where in fact the ice was so thick that they would have oxen on the ice, okay? Whereas now, of course, the river never freezes. So indeed, the whole idea that climate is stable and we have suddenly come along to mess it up is simply not true. You know, there have been times in Earth's history when the whole planet was covered with ice. That's some scientists are saying even the oceans may have been covered with ice. And indeed, there are other times when there was no ice anywhere on the planet, even in the high mountains. So that kind of climate change is huge. Where I live right now in Ottawa, Canada, there used to be 2 kilometers of ice over our head only about, say, 20,000 years ago. And now, of course, there's none, fortunately. So climate really changes. There's no question about it. Now, the human contribution, that's very difficult to figure out, because it is some component of what is already a very small change. Because since 1880, the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, which is certainly, they're not a climate denier organization. If anything, they're alarmist. But regardless, they point out that the temperature change averaged over the world, which is a very difficult thing to figure out, has increased. The temperature has gone up about 1 degree Celsius, okay? And that's the official number. So that's not very significant. We hear with regards to extreme weather that extreme weather has been increasing and that, you know, we're headed for catastrophe. But in fact, the very best database in the world is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA.gov, and I'll send you the link afterwards. It has state records for all extreme weather. maximum temperature, minimum temperature, most rain, most snow, greatest wind gust, all sorts of things. And what they find is that there is no increase in extreme weather in recent years. In fact, the interesting thing is that in the whole of 2017, and remember, there's at least 5 records per state for 50 states, so there's a lot of records. There was only 1 record set in the whole of 2017, and that was for the maximum wind gust in California. In several years between now and the year 2000, there were no records set at all, 0, okay? You have to go back to the 1930s to find when extreme weather records were being set frequently. And I'll just give you an example. I'll just move the screen over here a little bit. I opened up that database, and for example, Alabama, maximum temperature 1925, okay? The next one on the list is Alaska, maximum temperature 1915. If I zip down to California, are you in California, by the way?
I'm actually in BC, Canada.
Oh, you're in BC, Canada. Sorry, I don't have the Canadian record here. But the American database is probably the best in the world. I mean, a lot of Canada is not covered. For example, in the Global Historical Climatological Network, there is only 1 station, I understand, for the whole of northern Canada, and that's in a place called Eureka. And the interesting thing is that that's actually what's called a refugia. It's an area of unusual warmth. And not surprisingly, the scientists would rather live there. So there's very, very, very little data in Canada. But looking at the states, there's a lot better data. California, for example, maximum temperature July 10th, 1913 at 134 degrees. So, you know, we're not really talking about anything extraordinary happening. This is something that, you know, so what's the basis of the climate scare? Sea level has been rising since the end of the last glacial. About 8,000 years ago, it was rising 10 times faster than now, because there was a lot more ice to melt. In the last century, it's been rising at about 7 inches per century, and we don't actually know if there's been an acceleration. There's a big argument about that. And then you look at pH. People say, oh, well, global warming's evil twin. If it's not global warming, we're having ocean acidification. Well, I was just at a conference in New Orleans called the America First Energy Conference, and people can go on the web to americafirstenergy.org. They type it in. And I introduced a panel, I'll be on there, and there were scientists, of course, speaking. And one of them was David Legates from the University of Delaware, I believe. And he was talking about how the pH thing is a scam. And here's what he explained to us, and I'm going to have to write about this in op-eds and things because it is really quite outrageous. People wanted to find out what would happen if the ocean became more acidic. Would it damage the marine ecosystems? So in their tests, what they did is they poured in hydrochloric acid into the water, and they did their tests. You know, and that means a reduction in pH because low pH is high acidity. So they looked at it, and they could see these terrible things happening to the marine organisms. And they said, oh, therefore, as the pH lowers in the ocean because of various chemistry, I won't go into it, we're going to see a lot of destruction of the ecosystem. However, David Legates pointed out that the natural environment does not increase its pH by increasing hydrochloric acid. What it does is it increases a different acid called carbonic acid, which doesn't have that effect at all. In fact, the increase in CO2, which can lead to the carbonic acid increase, actually can result in greater growth. And he showed examples of crabs, for example, that were grown in whereas a CO2 enriched environment, and they were much bigger. You know, so he says that even the pH, the ocean acidification worries are wrong. They're just simply wrong. So what you have to say then is, what is the foundation of the climate scare? I mean, what is really driving this? Because what's happening now and in the last 100 years is not out of the norm from natural variability. So what's driving it? I mean, where's all these scares coming from? Well, they're coming from computer models, okay? And there's over 100 models that they frequently cite, but none of them, virtually none of them, actually come close to what's actually happened on the real world. And you know, one of the scientists was saying, you know, if you're talking to children and you're trying to show them how uncertain this science is, ask them this. If the science was settled, there would be one model, and it would be right, and that would be it. Instead, they have something like 107 models, and they show a massive variation in forecasts. So obviously, the science is all over the map. And that's the conclusion I come to, is we really don't know what the future of climate is going to be. These models say that we could have catastrophic climate change. But if you go a few years into the past and you take the model and you plug in the conditions, let's say 50 years ago, and then you put in what happened with increasing carbon dioxide, you don't get today's conditions. So the models don't work with the real data. So to try and use those models to forecast climate catastrophe, well, it doesn't really make any sense. And Roy Spencer actually in 2006 had a Senate hearing where he showed the government, or it might have been a House of Representatives, but it was a hearing, and he showed the government, and I'll send you the link, where the models forecast and where the real data is. And he said, this cannot be a legitimate basis for policy formulation because the models don't work. And that is the basis, though, of the whole climate scare, is the models, because what's happening now is pretty nothing. It's trivial. You know, the answer really to most of what's happening now is, yes, in a regional, local basis, there can be extremes. And you know, there's no question about what you said at first. But in a global sense, so what? I mean, there's nothing really going on.
So this is just the Earth doing its normal thing. But now we have to look at the picture of how much are we either escalating or will escalate it. But I think where the consciousness comes in is that it is a fact that we are contaminating our oceans with plastic.
Oh, for sure.
And it is a fact that we are seeing more escalations of, you know, of fires and drought. But this, you're saying, is just the natural process of the Earth warming up.
Well, partly. The forest fires, actually, that's an interesting question. You know, it's interesting. Stephen Pine from the Arizona State University West, I believe that's his school, he's also an expert in forest fires. And he points out, I believe it's Stephen Pine, yeah, he's the fourth. He points out that before the white people got to North America, there would be fires that would cover areas that were the equivalent of a whole state. And they would typically rage for a long, long time until they ran into a major river. And that would be all that would stop it. But we've done two things. We control those fires. We stop them. That's the first thing. The second thing is that many environmentalists don't want us to clear the underbrush and the debris that builds up in the forest because there aren't forest fires. So it's a tinderbox waiting for a fire to occur. And we put homes, in many cases, right beside these fires, or I should say these forests. So to a large extent, you know, if we're going to stop forest fires, then we better get in and clean out the underbrush. You can't have it both ways. You can't say we're going to have no fires and we're going to let all this dead debris build up. So we're actually, you know, we're tampering with nature in such a way that we have to, because you can't let forest fires cover a whole state nowadays.
Right, exactly.
but you've got to do something else. You have to clean up what nature would otherwise clean up on its own.
Right. I had somebody else a couple of years ago from Northern California. Actually, his correlation was to break up from Southern California and make it its own state. But he was talking about that, and now the fact that they stop going in and doing controlled fires.
Right.
We are ending up with more fires because they get out of control very quickly. And if we went in and, as you said, cleared the debris, the very controlled fires, then we wouldn't have these extremes right now. So really what I'm seeing as a common denominator with all the problems that we're seeing in the world is this three-letter word called mankind. And it is what we're doing and what we're not doing. Now, Earth is doing its thing. And we can't say that Earth is, you know, it should be at this temperature, perfect for the, you know, the rest of existence, because that's not the way it works. It's a living organism. And I read the other day that human beings are 0.01 participants on the planet compared to all the other species, yet we are the most destructive. Now, you talked about the oceans and how the sea life, if it was carbonized instead, you know, with the I can't speak science or chemicals.
Carbonic acid.
Right. So, you know, how it adjusts, and what we've seen through, you know, time began, how nature and organisms adjust. They either become extinct or they adjust, or even new creatures come out of it. It's the people that find it the hardest to adjust are the human beings.
And you know, we're not preparing for climate change because climate is going to change. We're not even properly preparing for extreme weather. And I'll give you an example. You see, we're not saying there should be no funding dedicated to climate change or extreme weather. We're saying, yeah, humans probably have some contribution. Science has not yet evolved to the degree that we can forecast it. But we know that climate will change. We know there will be years when there's extreme numbers of hurricanes. So what you need to do is you have to get ready. Now, I'll give you a good example of where India, believe it or not, leads the United States by 1,000,000 miles. Along the coast of the Bay of Bengal, the India government has built storm shelters. Okay, now these storm shelters are multi-story. They stick on enormous concrete stilts, so the waves go underneath. And nobody on that coast has to walk more than half a kilometer to get to one of these storm shelters. And so that's called vertical evacuation. You walk a short distance and then you go up. Now, it's not nice living in those storm shelters. One of our scientists did, and he told me what it was like for 3 days. It's pretty lawless, actually. They have gangs and all sorts of things, and very stinky. It's funny, the story he told me, he said he actually went out on the veranda because he was trying to get away from all the things inside. And when he saw what was outside, you know, with pythons dying on the trees and bloated cows, and he said it was so bad, he just went back in.
Right.
So India has these, and this is something the United States has none of, okay? It's astounding. They have what they call this horizontal evacuation, which is jump in your car and drive like crazy until you're stuck in a traffic jam, and then the hurricane hits anyway.
Yes.
So the U.S., you know, they obviously have to spend money on public works projects, not just roads and bridges, but they need to build storm shelters. And in some places, they are well prepared. There was a part of Manhattan, for example, that did not lose its electricity or its internet or its cable during Hurricane Sandy. And the reason was they had their cables buried underground. So that's another way that even the developed world can help prepare for climate change, extreme weather, whatever happens.
Yeah, I mean, preparation, I mean, it's common sense, isn't it? I mean, my daughter lives in Toronto, and they keep getting these flash rains. And she sent me a picture the other day of this, you know, car just driving, thinking it's driving in, you know, just splash of water and just disappearing, you know, like glug, glug, glug.
Yeah.
And this happens so frequently there because the riverbanks get overflown. There isn't the way the rains come down, the water can't disperse fast enough. And so if what we have to do is stop looking at climate change as out to get us, and we've got to learn how to prepare for the climate that is happening, because we can't stop what's happening. It is what's happening. We can perhaps slow it down because we do contribute a great deal with the carbon, and just even the meat manufacturing market itself with the methane that goes off, the amount of water that we use for the cow industry, meat industry, the amount of grain that could feed people. There are so many areas that we need to change.
Yeah, but I would say we need to change those for different reasons. I would say we need to change those because they're not sustainable in many ways from an environmental perspective for pollution or for resource depletion, things like that. You know, you have to remember, I mean, if we've had only a 1 degree Celsius temperature change and CO2 has gone up 40% in that time from 1880 to today, then, and mankind is some fraction of that 1%. Some scientists say only a small fraction. Whatever fraction it is, the amount that we're all actually causing, yeah, it's there, it's undoubtedly there, but it's not really very much. And so, you know, here's where the real social injustice occurs. And this is something that might surprise you. When I was at the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009, I met with the Ethiopians. And, you know, they and the other African and developing countries were not very happy with what was going on because so much focus was on trying to stop climate change by building wind turbines or by building, you know, having carbon credit trading or things like that. There was very little attention paid to helping people adapt, especially in poor countries that really need help. And so when I got home, I thought, I wonder if they're right. I looked it up. There's a website, the Climate Policy Initiative. It's out of San Francisco, and they track what's called climate finance, which includes everything to do with climate change and how much do we really spend. And the biggest amount that we spend is on actually developing alternative energies, specifically to reduce carbon dioxide. Now, I'm not against alternative energies because they can be used to reduce real pollution and to give us, you know, alternative sources as we gradually run out of hydrocarbons. And someday, you know, we'll never totally run out, but it'll get very expensive. But what I found, and the Climate Policy Initiative think this is not enough. There is over $1 billion US being spent every day around the world on climate finance. And of that, now the UN wanted half of it to go to adaptation, helping the poor and especially adapt to climate change, move out of areas that have now become deserts, things like that. And the other half should go to, you know, stopping climate change. That was the idea, mitigation. So I thought, well, I wonder how close they've come to actually doing that. And the bottom line is they have got 95% of the money around the world is being spent on mitigation. Only 5% is going to help people adapt to climate change. And I think that's really criminal, because what you're saying then is that the possible discomfort, and we don't know how much discomfort, of people yet to be born is more significant than the suffering of people now. And, you know, I think that...
And you know, rather an oxymoron, because if people today are dying off because you're not paying attention to them, there will be no future people.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's take care of your own now, and then plant better seeds for tomorrow, right? You know, it's not all about foresting tomorrow. It's, well, what about the trees today? You know?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. If your child's bleeding to death, you don't pull out a university calendar and start reading and looking at courses, you know, because they may not be around. So yeah, I mean, I think that the focus is completely backwards. And even the UN, as I say, wanted half the money to go to adaptation. So, you know, it's just not happening. And you have to say, well, why is that? And this is where social justice warriors, I think, should be really upset. And I'm a social justice warrior in my own way. You know, I stand for more funding for nursing homes and all sorts of things, because both my parents lived in nursing homes at the end of their life, and it was pretty terrible. But the bottom line is that...
Done a story on that, yes.
Yeah, it's really outrageous. I mean, they have billions to spend on wind turbines, but they can't support our seniors, you know, like
I know. Or the veterans, or the children, and yes, the list goes on. Yeah.
It does.
Misappropriate funds. I think actually that is one, whether you're looking at environmental or looking at anything, is something that needs to be addressed. You know, I've got a series coming up called Let's Get Synced, and it's a bunch of people around the world where we're talking about the change of climate, but the change of the emotional climate, of, you know, of what we can do. And, you know, one of them is Simple Solutions, which is creating policies that every government, no matter, you know, what they are, cross-partisan, can adapt to, where everybody can agree on, where everybody can come to that global table on these policies, where everybody can change simultaneously and address what needs to be done. And I think what we're looking at is we really need to address some common sense, because as you said, the hysteria has gone so much that way. We're losing focus on what needs to be done right now. So it's, forget about the CNN effect. Let's take a deep breath and kind of what's in front of us right now, what needs to be done, and how can we change the lives of people that are facing right now the change in climate in their countries, where they need to be, you know, either, I mean, what we're looking at, I think, is the big thing that we're looking at is there's going to be a water shortage. Do you agree?
Well, yes, I think that, well, I mean, all these things are just so difficult to project. But I just wanted to finish the thought on social justice, if you don't mind, because this is amazing. You say, why would it be that 95% of the money is going into mitigation, trying to stop climate change, and only 5% goes into adaptation? Well, if you think about it, the big money is to be made by companies that build multi-million-dollar wind turbines, or get engaged in carbon credit trading, where they make enormous commissions. There's not a lot of money to be made in the boots on the ground approach that's needed to help people with building wells, or moving or relocating them to new areas. I mean, these are public works and other types of projects that don't make big corporations much money, if any. And so I think that what's happened here is that many organizations have glommed on to the climate issue so that they can sell their product.
Right.
Okay? And nuclear reactors are a good example. I mean, you wouldn't believe it, but a few years ago I was reading from the World Nuclear Association what was the greatest climate alarmism I have ever seen, more so than Al Gore, much more so than David Suzuki. And Suzuki I agree with on many issues, not this one. But the bottom line is the World Nuclear Association at that time, out of London, England, were essentially saying we're headed for catastrophe. Not millions, but billions of people will die, and that kind of language. And of course, the message was, therefore, buy our nuclear reactors. Now, I mean, I have friends who used to work in the nuclear sector, and they're very upset by this because they like to pride themselves on being accurate. Okay, there's a certain risk to nuclear power, and they would disclose it, and they would say, this is the risk, this is how we're containing it, these are the chances of things going wrong. So they prided themselves in being accurate. And the concern was that if they jump onto the climate scare bandwagon and even go farther than even the activists are, eventually they'll lose credibility. And, you know, that would be a great shame, because nuclear power has a part to play. Now, nuclear power disposal of waste is an interesting question, and we can talk about that later if you like, because
Yes, definitely like to address that.
there are good solutions, but we're not using them. If you'd like, we can talk about that for a second now.
Yes, when the waste is enormous, you know,
Yeah.
and disposing of the waste seems to be a problem, and also the consciousness is around about how much we waste. Yes, we have to address that. Otherwise, we're going to have more garbage than we're going to have anything else.
Well, that's right. And, you know, in the late 1990s, there was a report, I believe it was called the Seaborn Report, and they were looking at how do you dispose of this kind of waste. And it's first of all important to understand the different kinds of waste. In a CANDU reactor, they produce high-level waste, which is dangerous, okay? You can't hold it in your hands, it'd kill you. But it decays very quickly. Within 400 years, you could hold a used CANDU reactor bundle in your hands. And that was from one of my old professors in nuclear power. And however, there's other waste that is mid-level waste or low-level, they can be low-level waste too, which is still radioactive, things like gloves and stuff like that. And that can last a very long time, although the radioactivity is lower. So they looked at how, you know, how safe was it to store this waste in deep geologic formations in the Canadian Shield. Now, these are formations that have not moved for millions of years, okay? And so they analyzed, okay, if you bore down a mile into the Canadian Shield, and then you have horizontal tunnels that you fill with the waste, then backfill with concrete, what are the chances of anything escaping before the waste is no longer dangerous? And the chances, they said, were virtually zero. However, they said that while the safety from a technical point of view was very, very safe, the safety from a political point of view of any politicians that would really push this and build these storage sites, the safety, or I should say the risk was high. So they had kind of a social safety and a real safety. And the bottom line was that the social safety, the perception of it being very dangerous was so much that they never did it. Right. And so a lot of the waste is still being stored above ground, which is far more dangerous.
Yes.
So I mean, obviously nuclear waste has to be handled carefully, and we should, you know, look for other sources as well. Ontario, I believe, is mostly nuclear powered now, and so we got to handle that waste, and we really should be burying it in a place that's much safer than just leaving it on the surface. But once again, a lot of this comes down to consciousness and perception. People become very emotional about these issues. And they show nuclear bombs going off in the background when they talk about nuclear power.
Right.
You know, in North America, the number of people who've died from nuclear accidents is zero. There's none. Okay, obviously Chernobyl, there were quite a few, and it was a mess. But you have to remember that those reactors use what are called graphite moderators, okay? They're actually made of solid graphite. And there was a graphite fire, I understand. But that can't happen in North American reactors because in Canada, for example, we use heavy water, and that's not going to burn. So the strange thing is, though, even after the first reactor disaster, they kept operating reactors like that. But it acted as a real impediment to the building of reactors in North America, even though it didn't apply.
Right.
I mean, and of course, it was very
cells, right? Don't forget fierce cells.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And so other industries are, you know, going to protect their own by putting the fear of the alternative. We're seeing this pattern over and over again, right?
Yeah. Well, in many things. I mean, vaccines, and I don't know much about that issue, but the bottom line is it's very much like out of the appendix to 1984 when they talked about Newspeak, how the government designed the language so that people would no longer really think. They would just quack like a duck. You remember? That was the
emojis?
Yeah, that's right. And this Newspeak included all kinds of nice phrases and language which would make people think the way the government wanted them to think.
Sure.
And that's happened a lot in the climate debate. For example, Barack Obama, when he wrote his clean power plan, okay, shouldn't be called clean because the only gas they were controlling was carbon dioxide. There was no actual pollution control. They called it right in the official bill on the US government website, they called it carbon pollution. Now, there's two problems there. First of all, it's no more carbon than is PCBs or our bodies. I mean, carbon, it makes, you know, thousands and thousands of compounds, some of which are poison, some of which are carbon dioxide, some of which are butterflies and bees. Carbon does a lot of things. You know, real carbon is things like graphite and diamonds, and these Buckminster fullerenes, you know, these little, those are real carbon. But what we're really talking about in the climate debate is carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
And we know from our grade 5 science that carbon dioxide is plant food. It's, along with water and sunlight, it's what makes plants run. And now I'll tell you something kind of ironic. They've done a lot of tests with carbon dioxide. Some leading scientists, there's an organization called CO2 Science.org. It's led by a PhD, Dr. Craig Idso. And they have done tests in greenhouses to show what effects does it have on plants if we do end up with carbon dioxide as high as people fear, perhaps double today's 410 parts per million. And what they find is that plants grow much faster. And of course, that's not surprising. That's why they pump greenhouses full of CO2.
Right.
They find other things too. This will really surprise you. They find that plants, as they have more CO2, don't need as much water. And so one of the forecasts is that they'll become so much more drought resistant that parts of the world that currently cannot grow plants because they're too dry, as CO2 rises, they will become green. Okay, plants will start to grow in regions that currently cannot grow plants. And Craig Idso spoke at the America First Energy Conference in Houston last November. I wrote an op-ed about it, actually. I can send it to you as well. And he said that as a result of this increasing CO2, we've seen a tremendous increase in crop yield across the world, and it's going to continue to increase. So his point is that, and I know climate people will hate me for this, but his point was, let's hope CO2 continues to rise, because as a gas, it's not toxic to us. It could be 25 times as high as today, like they have in submarines, and it's still not toxic. I mean, eventually, if you don't want to have too much, if you had 1,000 times, that wouldn't be good because you'd be replacing the oxygen. But carbon dioxide itself is not a pollutant. It's not toxic. It's plant food. And you know, many of the plants that evolved in today's world evolved at a time when CO2 was much higher in our atmosphere. So that's why they're actually CO2 starved right now. And when we try to enhance growth in greenhouses, we fill them full of CO2. We don't, I mean, it obviously has other gases too, but we might easily double or triple the CO2 level. See, right now there's 410 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. And climate activists get very excited about this because they say, well, that's a 40% increase from before 1880. But a 40% increase is trivial in comparison with what nature has done. There were times in the past, 440 million years ago, for example, which was a very cold period. It was a cold house, much colder than an ice age. And CO2 was 1,100% of today's level. And you say, whoa, I thought it was a warming gas. And yet nature shows us that at times CO2 was very high and it was cold. At other times CO2 was high and it was hot. At other times it was just in the middle. In geologic time, looking at the last 500 million years, and this is what pulled me over to become what you might call a climate skeptic, there's no correlation in geologic history. And it's interesting, you know, when I first was talking about this, I wasn't really focused on it. I was focused more on the space program, but I did reference it once in a while. For example, how exploring Venus is a good example for the Earth, because we don't want to have happen there what happened here. And I said, oh, and it's a runaway greenhouse effect, which could, you know, easily be simulated on Earth. And a professor at Carleton, actually, Professor Patterson, he used the article I wrote. It was in the Ottawa Citizen. And he said, yeah, this is a good article. He had his class read it. But he said, but this part on CO2 is wrong. What happened on Venus cannot happen on the Earth. It's physically impossible for two reasons. Earth has oceans and Earth has plate tectonics. And what's constantly happening is the CO2 comes into the ocean. It's eventually precipitates out into limestone and things like that. And then the ocean pulls it in, okay? Because there's plate tectonics. It pulls it in, and therefore the ocean surface can absorb more carbon. So it's constantly, it's a constant sink.
Assimilating it.
Yeah, it's absorbing it. So, and of course, Venus, as far as we know, doesn't have plate tectonics, but regardless, it doesn't have oceans.
Right.
But there's two other reasons. One is that the surface pressure on Venus is 100 atmospheres, 100 times our pressure. And as you press a gas, it gets hot. And the final reason, and this didn't occur to most people until I brought it up, and because I taught a course at Carleton in this area. When Dr. Patterson went on sabbatical, he invited me to teach his general survey course, because I'm not a specialist, but I knew enough to teach that course. Venus has a very long day. And it's not very different from its year. So if this is the sun and this is Venus, it's turning very, very slowly. So a day on Venus lasts months. It lasts a very long time. Unlike the Earth, which turns and every 24 hours can cool off to space because the dark side is not, receiving radiation, we get this 24-hour cooling cycle and then warming. But Venus can bake and bake and bake for weeks on end before eventually the others. So those, when you look at all those reasons, including carbon dioxide, it has a contribution, undoubtedly. But Venus is not an example of what could happen on the Earth. It just isn't.
You can't compare, right? Chalk and cheese, right?
Yeah.
So, we're looking at today an incredible amount of innovations. Where there is a need, there is an innovation. And we're seeing so many different type of technologies and innovations coming up. There's also a consciousness that's rising, in realizing that, let's take our sea world, and never mind what's going on with the carbon dioxide or anything else, with the plastic, as I said earlier,
No, that's a problem.
the waste, human beings are the most destructive, but we're also absolutely brilliant at solutions if we choose to be.
If we choose to, yeah.
And we're incredibly adaptable if we choose to be. But we're also very opulent. We think that this is something that we're entitled to, and from that opulence comes a great deal of waste. I'm definitely, through the shows that I'm doing, and of course this entire series that's coming up, is about that consciousness of changing our ways.
Right.
The planet is doing its thing. It's how do we change it now? Whether we're going fossil fuel or whether we're going alternative, there's many other reasons for going against the fossil fuel. Mining and things like this, it's healthier for the people, the miners. It's can produce perhaps cleaner and better energy. There's a whole argument along there. But as far as being mindful on our practices, we do really need to look at, never mind looking at how we're going to take all that waste and where we're going to put it, but what we're going to make things out of that will be more biodegradable, that won't have to go into these great big huge crevices anywhere. I'm seeing that, but are you seeing that as a scientist, where we're becoming much more conscious of the fact of our, disposable things?
Well, I just want to make a couple of quick points. Coal, it's interesting. This is a piece of bituminous coal from Kentucky. And it's not, coal itself can be burned cleanly. If we bring in the latest technology, the United States has more coal reserves than anybody on the planet. There are parts of the United States, Kentucky, Virginia, places like that, which it'd be very difficult for them to stop using coal. So what they need to do is use the latest pollution control devices, the best mining techniques. They have these mining wall machines, okay? They have an operator who sits a long way from the wall, and they grind into the machine, and it lands on a conveyor belt, and it takes it out. So it's very, very different to the old kinds of coal mining. And the other thing, of course, is land reclamation. If they're mining on the surface, they now reclaim to an enormously better extent than they ever did before. Now, I'll admit, they have their own bias, of course, but they took me on tours in Kentucky of some of these areas that were, surface mined. And the actual land was in better shape after it had been reclaimed. It had greater biodiversity than before the mining even occurred. So mining and these other operations, the use of coal, it can be done in a much cleaner way. But concerning the conscious, and it is being done in a cleaner way in many places, not so much in China, but which is a problem because China gets 80% of its electricity from coal, and they're continuing to build more and more and more coal stations. And you can understand it because they're trying to pull their people out of poverty, but there's a big kind of disconnect between making them more wealthy but ruining their health.
Yes.
Because, so on the consciousness issue, I spoke at the first Earth Day, at least the first major one around here, in 1990. I can't remember, was that the year they started? But regardless, I spoke at a couple of them in the 90s. And one of the things I was promoting was this poster of the Earth as seen from, I believe it was Apollo 8. It was called A Planet in Every Classroom. And there was a group, and I believe they were based in Vancouver, if my memory's right. And they were trying to get this as a consciousness rising symbol to have in every classroom everywhere in the world. And I was promoting that, and I still do if I have the opportunity, because they say that image was in fact probably the most important image of the 20th century, because it showed that, the idea of this planet, beautiful, fragile planet hanging in space all by itself, was no longer just a philosophical concept. The average man could see it in a newspaper on the front page, okay?
Yeah.
And they say this was actually one of the major drivers that launched the modern environmental movement. And if you look at the timing, the date of that picture, I can't remember, it'll come back to me in a minute, 1968, that's right, it was Apollo 8. Within a few years, you saw the formation of Environmental Protection Agency, Greenpeace, all sorts of organizations. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think that, sure, there were many activists that had this very environmentally friendly and activist approach. But when the average person saw the Earth against the blackness of space, and especially when they saw Earthrise over the dead, desolate moon, the contrast was so awesome.
Yes.
You know, there are quotes that from the astronauts, and they were just moved. I mean, some of them became quite religious. Others had New Age spirituality. Edgar Mitchell founded the Institute for Noetic Sciences. And a lot of this sort of influence on their consciousness, they brought back to Earth, and they started to educate other people. And we find in many ways, even today, the astronauts are strong environmentalists. Yes. Now, the thing is, though, they have to get their facts right. And yes, it's good for the consciousness raising, but you still have to know what you're focused on. You should focus on real pollution, conserving energy, taking no regrets approaches. And this is the thing that I'm always saying. Look, if you take a no regrets approach where you're reducing pollution, saving energy, reducing consumption, you will also reduce greenhouse gases.
Right.
And there's no problem with that.
Yes.
So instead of focusing on CO2 by having ridiculous schemes like pumping it underground, which has got to be about the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And that's one area that I agree with Elizabeth May on. She says, well, it's not going to stay there, you know. I mean, it's like putting something bad under your pillow. It's going to come out.
Brush it under the carpet.
Yeah. Right. I mean, and if it does leak, that's a real problem, because while CO2 is not a pollutant, if you're living near a CO2 sequestration site and it comes out, it's heavier than air. It forms a dome over wherever it goes, and everything inside it dies, except the plants, of course. All the people die. They've had natural leaks of CO2 in the Cameroons just a few decades ago, where a Lake Lagos, I believe it was called, was actually bubbling CO2 out, a massive, invisible, okay, can't see it, can't smell it, but this invisible bubble of CO2 went rumbling down the valley, killing livestock, killing people. And there's a story of one guy who saw all these people falling dead. He didn't know what's going on. He couldn't see anything, couldn't smell anything. He jumped on his motorcycle and drove like crazy. Fortunately for him, he drove, coincidentally, in the right direction, and he survived. So, you know, the whole idea of pumping CO2 underground to stop climate change, it's risky in that sense. It also increases pollution, because you've got to build all these pipelines from a station, because, you know, you're not going to find a geologic formation to store it easily right under a station. So you probably have to build hundreds of miles of pipelines, which causes a lot more pollution. A lot more energy is used, because you have to compress it to put it underground. So what you end up with,
all you need is just one tiny leak.
Yeah.
Right. It's not like an oil spill, you know, and get cleaned up. One tiny leak, all of a sudden, everybody flops dead.
Well, anybody nearby who gets enough. Yeah. So you know, here's where some people say, well, don't you want a cleaner planet? Yes, but let's do it properly, because if you focus on the wrong thing, in this case, reducing and storing CO2, you can end up creating far more problems on other things. So what we say is, reduce pollution, save energy, conserve, do these sensible things, rise consciousness so people don't consume so much in the first place.
Right.
Those things are no regret solutions.
Right.
Whether the climate issue is a problem or not,
it's common sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I totally agree. The consciousness rising, especially on the plastics issue, my God, you know, they say that 90% of the plastics that's in the ocean is coming from 10 rivers, 7 of which I believe are in Asia, especially China. There is plastic just pouring down into the ocean from there. And so, you know, and this
apparently it would go around France 3 times the amount of plastic that's there. So, you know, it's and the thing is, as you said, you know, the climate is changing. We have to change our climate. And we're not talking about the environmental climate. We're talking about our living climate.
Oh, yeah.
You know, we do have to change our ways. We do have to prepare for what is coming. You know, there are places, most certainly Africa and various other places, where literally, like the Sahara Desert, no longer abundant, it's dried up. Now, of course, there are some amazing innovations out there. You know, there's one from the Colorado showcase where they can extract water out of the air. I mean,
Sure.
there's an awful lot going on scientifically. I would prefer to see the money being put behind these innovations that become daily solutions of the now. When you take care of the now, you're preparing for tomorrow. If we're constantly preparing for tomorrow without taking care of the now, we won't have a tomorrow.
Well, yes, and also, you know, I went to an Ontario government hearing where they wanted public input on their climate change plan. And there were a couple of people who had similar views to me who got up to the microphone and they were booed and swore at, and the audience was just horrible. And the government was asking, among other things, what was the major obstacles to progress? And I got to the mic and I didn't bother making their points. I said, in my opinion, the major obstacle to progress is a lack of tolerance of alternative points of view.
Yes.
And as a consequence, we never hear about things like this. I'll just grab it. It's a report. This report, 1,000 pages. Okay. I actually gave it to...
It's got some light on it. There we go. That's good.
I gave it to Canada's Minister of the Environment, and I explained to her, this is talking about the biological impact of increasing carbon dioxide. And there are thousands of papers here that show that it's beneficial. There's another report equally big about the science as to what's causing climate change. And again, there are thousands of reports that show that the human contribution is almost certainly very small, so we should focus on pollution reduction and conserving energy and things like that. But these reports are, and people can look it up on the web. All of these reports, I believe there's about 10 of them.
By the way, for people who are only listening and not watching, it's called Climate Change Reconsidered. What's the last bit? Just reconsidered?
Just two. Biological impact.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, I'll raise it up here a bit.
There we go.
And they have these reports, and they are pretty amazing. If people can read, and actually the nice thing is every chapter has a summary in layman's language, which you can read in 10 minutes.
Right.
And if people go to climatechangereconsidered.org, they can see these reports, and you can download them. And I gave them to the minister, and she had never even heard of them. Okay, Catherine McKenna, she's a very nice lady, very polite, but she'd never even heard of them. So I said, you know, it's
because
really
the focus is not in the right direction.
That's right. I said, you know, your advisors have to tell you the whole story. I mean, you still may hold the views that you have now, but these are leading scientists. Thousands of references, okay, are in here from many of the leading journals in the world that give an alternative perspective. They're not saying go out and pollute the earth and forget it. No, what they're saying is focus on the right stuff.
Yes.
And focus on understanding what's really happening. And that's where the consciousness really needs to change. You know, in The Next Generation, Star Trek, you remember that?
I'm a Trekkie and a Star Wars fan.
Well, Data was trying to evacuate some colonists from a planet because this horrible alien race was coming to repossess the planet, and they would undoubtedly kill them all. Now, the colonists didn't want to leave. In fact, they didn't even want Data to present the case. And so Data said to them, and I think this applies to many people, not just on this debate, but in many debates, he said, is your point of view so weak it cannot withstand rational debate? And that's the point. I mean, if they're so confident about the science, then why will they not ever reference this?
Right.
Okay? Why will they not even allow people to speak out at hearings without booing and swearing at them and trying to get them to shut up? I mean, this is supposed to be a freedom of speech democracy, not 1984.
Not lately.
Yeah, exactly.
Not lately.
You know,
but it's also, I think, it's so much though. I call it the CNN effect, which is they take a pimple and make it into a volcanic eruption. You know, they're selling on fear. Who's driving that fear? You know, the various politicians who are in the pockets of, you know, or corporations that want to keep the status quo. And they don't want anything else that's going to contradict that, that's going to actually put the emphasis on really consumption and waste. Because really, when you're bottom lining it, as you're saying, as a human race, all 7 billion of us, isn't having much of an environmental effect, but our practices are. The way we consume, the way we manufacture, the way we waste is the real issue here.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. And that's why the consciousness rising is the critical first step. Because if people don't care, it doesn't
Mm.
matter what science you use, they're still going to buy the most gas guzzling car. And there can be
Yes,
better cars and cheaper and not cheaper necessarily, but they can be much more environmentally
yes,
friendly. And so the consciousness raising that occurred as a result of this image from space, I think that was key. And that's why, I often talk, when I'm giving presentations, I tell them, I'm not right wing, okay? I don't hate the earth. I think we need to protect the planet. I think we need to do the right things, but we have to also be open to alternative points of view,
yes,
because who knows, we might be wrong, okay? And,
right.
and I was on the other side of the climate debate, and Dr. Patterson invited me into his office because he was criticizing my article, that part of it anyway. And I thought, who is this evil climate change denier? This right wing oil funded or whatever. And whoa, he surprised me. He showed up. He was a bicycle pedaling, black bearded guy who just adopted a baby from China. And he's totally different to what I expected.
Hmm.
And he introduced me to all kinds of other scientists, mainly geologists, because they have this long time frame perspective. And I realized over time that my position was wrong. That in fact, yeah, we have to protect the environment, but the idea that we control the climate and that we
Yes,
can stop this from no, it just doesn't make sense. And so I think people have to keep their minds open. You don't have to become left or right wing to
right.
adopt an
Yeah,
idea.
as I said, we're all participants and we're all renters here on Earth.
Yeah,
And when we got to realize, I don't care if you're black, white, pink, yellow, where you're from, you're on this planet, and as planetary beings, we've got to kind of really pull our socks off and take the blinkers off and look at what's happening. Climate will change. It's
yeah.
inevitable. It is happening. How we adjust to it is something that needs to be addressed. Ways that we can protect ourselves needs to be addressed. But the bottom line, as I see it, the consciousness of how we consume, the way we treat life, which I'm now talking to the manufacturing of animals. It's
Mhm.
not only inhumane, but it's also the amount of grain for feeding those animals could feed an entire hungry nation. The amount of water they're using is overconsumption, the amount of methane, the list goes on. We have to start looking at our practices. I interviewed Renee Schulmelt, who did a wonderful documentary called Normal is Over.
Mm.
And when you look at really, she interviews scientists from around the world, and the bottom line of it, and really the common denominator I got out of that was our consumerism. And
Mhm.
we are so dictated by that. And when you look at the organizations, as you mentioned earlier, they're protecting their pocketbook, they're
Oh yeah.
protecting their bottom line, and they're going to spin any yarn at you in order to
Mhm.
protect that. Now,
And,
if we
and
have to, as human beings, step out of that ignorance and look at some facts for ourselves,
Oh yeah, yeah,
right?
exactly. And sadly, the extreme view on climate change is going to continue for a lot longer
Mm-hmm.
because the money driving it is enormous.
Yes.
When Climate Works Foundation was founded in 2008, they had over $500 billion with a B. I mean, most groups, they start with $1,000 in the bank and 10 volunteers, and they very gradually grow, and maybe after years and years, they get $1 million budget. But this group started with over $500 million. And they then farmed a lot of the money out to Al Gore's group and other groups. And they are still getting, looking at their last few years, they're still getting tens of millions a year. Now, you think about it. When I was in Copenhagen, we put out a news release that got pretty good coverage across the world. It cost $7,000. We can't afford to do that very
Right.
often. I mean, maybe
Exactly.
you do
Money
it twice.
talks. Money
Yeah,
talks.
that's right. Maybe we can do it once or twice a year at that level. But if you have
Yeah.
$500 million, you can put
Look
out
at the
several.
messages you can put out.
Boom,
But
it's
that's
going
but that's again,
everywhere.
but that's where it's buyer beware.
Mhm.
We've been taught, and especially in this last 30, 40 years, that more is better, more is status.
Mhm.
Opulence is good, right?
Mhm.
This is what we've been taught. But we have a more neurotic society, more insecure society, more
Dogmatic.
dogmatic, certainly more mental stresses
Oh,
than we've
yeah.
ever seen before, and people trying to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. That big house, that big car, that big this, that big that. We have a global nation in the Western society of being the unhappiest they've ever been.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. And
right?
you know, the whole
The
business of
focus is on the wrong thing.
yeah, and the dogmatism is really dangerous, okay?
Yes.
And I'll give you an idea. I mean, you remember Al Gore's film was called An Inconvenient Truth,
Hmm.
okay? And Truth to Power in the second film. There's a professor of this philosophy of science at Lehigh University. He teaches a course called, and it's one of the great courses. You know, they have this program with many courses on history and philosophy and mathematics. He teaches a course called The Science Wars. And he talks about how in the late 1990s, the physical scientists, you know, physicists, people like that, were claiming that they were finding truth, okay, absolute truth about the world. And the social scientists were saying, no, 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 that's your opinion based
Hmm.
on your interpretation of the observations.
Hmm.
And everyone has known since ancient Greece that observations are always qualitative. It's a function of who's observing. You know, it's a
Right.
function of your background and how you interpret it, of your society. There's all kinds of idols of the mind. Remember, Francis Bacon talked about the idols of the mind, idols of the tribe and the marketplace, and because of your schooling and all sorts of things. And all these things turn what you think is fact into really just opinion.
Right.
And and this is where I say to people, it's okay to have different opinions, but don't tell me that your side is the truth,
Right.
mine is a lie,
Right.
because you don't know that.
But that's
All
not a
you
conversation. That's a
know.
dictation.
That's right.
Yeah.
And sadly, people on our side of the argument in the climate debate will also say, you're wrong, you're lying, I have the truth. And I
Right.
say to them privately after the talk, I say, no, 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 you can't say that. And you know, Professor Goldman himself is quite left-wing, if I understand rightly. He does agree with Al Gore on the climate change issue, but he says, but he's totally wrong to say that he has the truth. All
Yes.
he has is the opinion of a lot of experts on one side, but there's equal experts on the other side. And
Right.
so I think part of this dogmatism, which drives all kinds of things like abortion debate. I mean, you end up with abortion doctors getting shot, you
Yes.
know,
Oh,
and,
I mean,
and
alternative health, people
yeah,
getting killed. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's, oh,
our lead scientist, Dr. Tim Ball, has had 5 death threats. Okay, I mean, this is ridiculous. I
no.
mean, we
It's
are dealing,
pathetic, actually. It's pathetic.
yeah.
It really is.
So in addition to the consciousness rising, or as part of the consciousness rising, we have to get off our dogmatic high horse and
Yes. Thank you. Yes.
recognize that, yeah, we have opinions and we could be wrong. I was wrong. I changed my point of view and I could change it again if new information comes forward.
Right.
And I think that in that way we can have public hearings where people can all participate without feeling threatened.
Right.
And that's the only way we're going to come up with good answers.
It's the common denominator that we want to look at, right? You know, it's like, you know, when you're creating a new dish, you're going to try all sorts of ingredients and spices, and you might make the dish a few times before you find, oh, this is the right combination,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
But if you don't try those different alternatives, oh no, that would go better. That spice would be better. How are you ever going to get to that perfect dish? Well,
That's
it's the
right.
same with science. It's the same with humanity. It's the same across the board. There is so much knowledge out there, but there isn't a great deal of wisdom.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I've had like teachers call me and say, you know, I hear from you and I hear from David Suzuki and Al Gore. I don't know who to believe. What should I tell
Yes,
my
yeah, I
students?
know,
What should I tell
exactly.
my students? And I say, well, tell them you don't know, because there is such a disagreement among experts. The students should learn about that disagreement. And, you know, it's part of the maturing process, I think, to make decisions in the face of uncertainty. I mean,
Yes,
it doesn't mean you do nothing,
no,
but if you wait until you have perfect certainty, you are immobilized. I mean, you have to, you know,
and you'll be
Toastmasters,
dead.
I'm a member. I have I was at a Toastmasters meeting the other day, and they said, make a choice to take a chance to make a change. Okay? Now
Yes,
you have to, at some point, step forward. You may not be 100% sure. In fact, you'll never be 100%
no,
sure about virtually everything, according to philosophers. But if you are immobilized waiting for that certainty, you'll never do anything. So I think we have to have a new consciousness approach that recognizes that all of these decisions are risk management exercises. You know, the government shouldn't say the science is settled, we're moving forward, this is what we're
right,
doing, everyone else is a liar. That doesn't make sense.
no. And it's also, you know, what we're talking about is we're not talking about competition. We're talking about collaboration. This is a
Yeah.
global concern from
Mm-hmm.
people, every single participant on this planet. And we have to have a voice. And it
Yeah.
shouldn't be any one voice is bigger and louder, because that becomes a bully. And it's
Yeah.
not a conversation, it's not a collaboration, it's also not an invitation to the creative ideas. If you're shutting
Mhm.
people down, how are you ever going to get to the solutions or the resolve? Because you've shut down the creativity.
Right. And I think if you don't hear them out, you might not realize that you actually do agree on helping
Right.
people who need help adapting, reducing real pollution, saving energy and resources. We might find that 80% of the things we already agree on.
Right. Right. And also, the wake up call, I speak very much to the consciousness. This is what this station is about, what we can do to change, and that we have to change. This isn't to sit back and wait for everyone else to do it. We have to step up in responsibility and ownership and be a participant. And whether it's
Yeah.
big or small, we've got to step forth. And whether it's small, changing practices that you're not going to use plastic anymore, or you're going to go vegan, or you're going to go to electric vehicles. I don't care which way, or all of the ways you do it. It's stepping up and
Yeah.
being a participant. But do it based on a consciousness that you know that change is needed, but also do
Sure.
it on information that you feel comfortable enough to understand and have it motivate you to do something. But don't
Yeah.
just sit back and say, oh, that person's got the bigger spotlight on them, so therefore they must be right. That person doesn't have as much backing, so therefore they must be wrong, because
Oh,
now
yeah.
I'm being ignorant.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about it. When Einstein was traveling around Europe promoting his theory of relativity, it was the German right that opposed him. Okay, and he was, and they had a list of 100 scientists who disagreed, and he said, "Well, if I was wrong, it would only require one scientist." you know. So I mean, and it is interesting in the climate debate how the position of Al Gore has become a left-wing ideal.
Mm.
Doesn't really make any sense. Okay, science shouldn't be about left versus
No,
right.
no.
It's just, well, let's open it up.
Yeah.
Let's nonpartisan. In fact, that's the whole point of ICSC, my group, and I guess I should end by telling you.
Yes, please,
It's
to how people get hold of you, and are all these things that you've talked about here today, will they find those articles there?
or they can email me and I'll give it to them right away.
Excellent.
Yeah, our webpage is climatescienceinternational.org, and we are nonpartisan. We say that right in our message. We have left-wingers who are advisors. Most of the scientists are nonpartisan, and there's right-wingers there too. But I'm all over the map. I'm left,
And we
right,
don't
center.
have to be any one thing or the other, right? Just be versatile.
That's right. So we're trying to make it safe for people on the left to be climate realists.
Yes.
Okay, that's what we're trying to do, and we are generally succeeding. People hear about it and they say, "Whoa, that sounds kind of crazy. You're going to let all these people die today because you're spending money on what might happen in 50 years." So yeah, we are pulling people over to, I think, a more sensible point of view.
And there's a lot of people out there, as I've said, that I've interviewed here in Eco Solutions and Self-Discovery Radio, that are contributing one way or the other, either through scientific innovations, from creating different types of laws, producing different policies that are easier to adapt or adopt to, or just simply being a motivator, or maybe even the financial structure of change without it, because people, bottom line, it's my pocketbook, my living, my sustainability. That's what everybody's looking at, right? Whether it's sustainability of their income, sustainability that there's going to be food and everything there tomorrow, sustainability, roof over their head. Everybody's looking out for that, and we want you to be sustainable, but we've also got to go and be open-minded as to how that sustainability is going to come along, and that we cannot, as human consumers, keep consuming at the rate that we're doing and wasting at the rate we're doing, because it's not the climate that's going to kill us, it's the pollution that's going to kill us if we don't get our act together.
It's a lousy way to live. I mean, you become so materialistic that you just lose out on all the fine points of life that you should be enjoying.
Right. And what we should be doing is learning to adapt to what is coming in the climate. Yes, we are getting warmer. What does that mean to us? Do we need to build different type of housing, that insulates the warmth, or, makes it cooler?
And we should also listen to those scientists in Russia who follow the sun, who say we're headed for global cooling, because they might be right. We just don't know.
And when do they say that might come about?
They're saying around the middle of the century, 2060, because at that point, all the cycles of the sun all hit rock bottom. And the last time that occurred, now again, it was a different world. I mean, it was not a world of industrialization, but the last time it occurred in the 1600s, I believe, the Earth was very cold. And they say, Dr. Abdusamatov, for example, who studies the sun, he says it will swamp any warming that we're causing, and we will have colder conditions. I don't know if he's right, but I'm certainly prepared to listen.
And the thing is, preparation. The stitch in time saves nine. If we know these type of things are coming, we're going to build housing. This, there's passive housing, which is more insulation and it takes less energy to run, and it's more sustainable housing. If we know that, build to these extremes, either it's too hot or it's too cold, have something that's going to weather both sides of the equation.
That's right.
If you don't open your mind up to what could be coming, you're going to get hit by the 2x4 when it does come.
Yeah, and you want crops that can be adapted, so they'll survive, so we don't lose our whole wheat crop if it does get 2 degrees colder.
Right. And by then we might be needing to farm under domes or whatever the case is in order to control it. But the whole thing is, in being aware what is possibly coming, we can start preparing today with those wonderful creative innovations by allowing those creators to come to the table with their ideas and not dismiss an idea because you don't agree with it. Put everything on the table. It's part of the puzzle. Totally. And it might not create today's picture or tomorrow's picture, but my God, it could create, down the road's picture and be part of that ingredient. We've got to be more open-minded, have an open dialogue with each other, not shut each other down. And, and also this whole thing, I hate you because I disagree with you. Please, folks, throw that out. It's just...
let's grow up.
Please. It's pretty disgusting behavior, right? And also agree to disagree. And that's called a conversation or called a debate. It doesn't have to be a hate fest, right? Yeah. Right? Exactly. So we learn, we can disagree, and we can get to that point where after that conversation, that we can actually look at, okay, what again is that root, the common denominator that we all came out with that we do agree on? And then where do we go from that? If we're not willing to listen, we're not willing to have the conversations, we're not willing to even have the debates, how are we ever going to get to the resolution?
Yeah, it's like what Zig Ziglar said. He said, some people's minds are like concrete, all mixed up and permanently set.
I like that.
I don't mind being mixed up, but I don't want to be permanently set.
No, and I'm very much the wind, constantly going this way and that way, and I'll flow with, where the wind takes me. But it's also observation. We've got to stop abstaining and saying it's the scientist's responsibility, it's government's responsibility, it's that responsibility, and start taking some ownership ourselves. Because if we're living here, it's also our responsibility, and that means first and foremost, be an open mind, right? Start learning how we can bring about some change, because climate change is here. What can we do to really, bottom line, is look at the pollution that we're creating, because that's going to be a bigger problem. So once again, your site?
It's climatescienceinternational.org.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being here today. I learned a lot, and this is going to be, you're going to come out the week before this whole series comes out, and I think it's a great way to actually start off, because it is a different type of perspectives. There are different types of solutions. There are different types of observations, and that's what we want. When we listen to all of them, we're going to take an observation from here and from there, and then we can come to our own conclusion. But if we're not willing to listen and digest, we're never going to get there.
That's right. And you might come up with a compromise that's even better than either of the two.
Exactly. Yes. But unless you're willing to be open-minded and truly listen and be, objective, and then digest it, let it savor, and then you'll come up with something and go, okay, I agree here, I agree there, this is what I'm going to do. Because ultimately it's the invitation of what are you going to do, right? What are you going to do? Exactly. Right. Well, thank you so much, Tom. This has been great. Thank you. And so glad we managed to get it in before the holidays.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That was fun.
So folks, remember, we are the solution, but also the problem, but we also need to listen. There are facts out there that can't be disputed. There are observations that need to be discussed. And what we really need to do is open up the whole gamut, take in all the information, and then use our wisdom of what we're going to do about it, not our hysteria or our fear. Let us step up, folks, because we're much better than the way we're behaving right now. Bye for now. For more wonderful shows like this, please go to selfdiscoveryradio.com, podcasts, and see our lineup. And if you wish to support us, we have a funded button. Please stay tuned for our next show.